This video will demonstrate how to calculate the mileage after a car trip. We're going to ask the user after the trip is over to enter the gas used and the mileage information, and we'll calculate the mileage using a function. We'll start with the pseudocode. Pseudocode, ordinary English statements in the proper order, which define all of the steps that the program needs, and pseudocode will help you to determine the actual code when you write the Python. All right, here we go with the pseudocode for the main function. All of this is going to occur after the trip, of course. We'll prompt the user for the odometer reading before the trip. We'll assign that to a variable called start miles. We'll assume that that's going to be an integer. We won't worry about fractional miles. After that, we'll prompt the user for the odometer reading after the trip and assign that to a variable n miles. And then finally, in order to calculate the mileage, we have to know how much gas was used, so we'll prompt the user to enter the gas used and assign that to gallons. Now we'll use the function. We'll call our function called find mileage, which we'll define in just a moment, and we'll pass in those three values as arguments. This function needs to know all three of those values in order to do the calculation. And we have to make sure that we put them in the right order. Let's take a look at the pseudocode for the function. Okay, this function is going to be called find mileage. First thing we have to do inside that function is we're going to subtract the starting miles from the ending miles to determine how many miles we traveled, and we'll assign that to a variable miles. Then we'll divide the miles by the gallons and assign that to variable mileage, and then finally we'll print that out accurate to 2 places of decimal. So this function is going to calculate and print out the mileage. That means this is going to be what we call a void function. This function does not return a value. It's going to instead perform a calculation and print the result. Now let's look at the Python code that will get this job done. First of all, the main method. The first three statements here are getting input from the user. We're going to prompt the user for the starting odometer reading, and we're going to assume that's an int, so we're going to use the int function to convert that string into an int, and we'll assign that to the variable start miles. In a similar fashion, we'll ask the user for the ending odometer reading, and we'll assign that to a variable called n miles. And then finally, we'll ask for the gallons used, and it's very unlikely that the gallons used is going to be an integer value, so we'll make that a float type so that it could have decimal places. And then finally, we'll call the function. Call the function is the computer term for execute the function. If we want to run or execute the function, we're going to call the function, and we call it by name. Find mileage is the name of our function, so we'll call it by name, find mileage, and we're going to pass in the start miles, the end miles, and the gallons as arguments. These three values, separated by commas, are the arguments for this function. Now let's look at the definition of the find mileage function. Here it is. We've got def find mileage, and then we have three values, three variables, separated by commas, but they aren't the same as the arguments that we used up inside main. When we define a function, the values that you put inside the parentheses are called parameters, and they don't have to be the same names as what you used up in main for the arguments. In fact, it's not a bad idea not to use the same names because it might confuse you into thinking that they are the same variables. They are not. These variables up here, the arguments, are only visible inside the main function. The parameter variables that we're specifying down here are only going to be visible inside find mileage. Now, it is important to get the order right. I've got miles 1 for start miles, miles 2 for end miles, and gas used for gallons. I have to make sure that I get that order right. Now, let's look up at the pseudocode for our find mileage function. Apparently, we've got 3 steps that we need. We've got to find the miles traveled by doing the subtraction. You can see that we do that here. Then we have to divide the miles by the gallons and assign that to a variable mileage. That's what this line is doing. And then finally, we're going to print that mileage out, and we will show it as miles with 2 decimal places, so we have to use the format function. What we want to format is the mileage variable, and we're going to format it to 2 decimal place accuracy. So let's see if this works. Give it a run, and we'll say we just got a new vehicle, relatively new vehicle, and our starting odometer reading was 2400, and maybe our ending odometer reading was 2800. That obviously means we're going to have traveled 400 miles, right? And let's say that that took up 24.5 gallons of gas. Well, that would give you a mileage of 16.3 miles per gallon for the trip, which is not great mileage. Must have a big engine or a heavy car. Definitely not an economy vehicle. Well, that's how it works. I hope you're okay with it. If you have any questions about that or any part of working with functions, get in touch with your professor.